back.
Time was running out on the builders of the Philadelphia Centennial. More than 5,000 men and women were working around the clock, but it was not going to be enough. This was an international fair that had started late and looked like it was never going to catch up. The thing is out of control, responsible people said. A fine example of Philadelphia's inability to manage, sniffed others. But the people of Philadelphia had no time to argue. They were building the biggest fair that ever was. So big that it needed more than 3 miles of fencing just to contain it, 106 gateways to get in and out of it, and a force of 2,000 guards to protect it. It was a fair that put down 63 miles of railroad track to deliver people and products, and purchased an entire lake in the state of Maine to supply ice for the lemonade and beer. It was a fair whose planners conceived of buildings that could span city blocks and wall spaces in terms of square miles. It was the best documented fair of all time and could report instantly how many thousands of trees had been transplanted, how many tons of exhibits had been delivered, and how many people were likely to faint if the temperature soared above 97 degrees. Figures were kept on the exact amount of sugar popcorn eaten each day, the numbers and ages of visiting school children, how many organ recitals had been given, how many people had come through the turnstiles in any 1 hour, and how many of these had paid in real or counterfeit money. The builders of the Philadelphia Centennial were worried about deadlines, but not disheartened. This exhibition they were building was going to be the biggest, the newest, and the best. The grandest fair of them all, they said, in that spring of 1876. And it was going to open on time. $9,910,966 people came to America's first birthday party in 1876. As celebrations go, there has been nothing like it before or since. Yet, some Americans in 1876 felt that the centennial year had little about it that was worth celebrating. To these people, the threat of economic collapse, the evidence of corruption in government, the excesses of youth, tides of foreign immigration, and the Indian Wars all spoke of catastrophe. But to Philadelphians, 1876 was a time of great expectations. After all, the nation was 100 years old, and it was still a nation. There had been depressions before. And if there was corruption in government, vote the rascals out. It was an election year. And what if the youth of the country were kicking over the traces, or that foreigners were everywhere, or that there was some Indian trouble out in the far Dakotas? By God, we were still a nation. So buckle your belt and let her rip, America, and let's have a grand old time. The one thing that everyone could agree upon was that something should be done to mark 100 years of American independence. When should the Jubilee take place? Well, Benjamin Willis, Democratic congressman from New York, thought that 1976 was a good date because by that time things would be more in hand. Where should the event be celebrated? The Atlantic Monthly knew exactly where. Any place but Philadelphia, a city that was consistently against anything new. Most New Yorkers agreed, as did the entire city of Boston. But John Welch, a businessman from Philadelphia, disagreed and persuaded wealthy Philadelphians to put up $25,000 as a beginning. Celebration was going to be in Philadelphia in 1876, and that was that. America was a nation of little people in science, politics, and war. A printer named Franklin had made inquiries into the nature of electricity. A farmer named Jefferson had helped create a new form of government. A school teacher named Whitney conceived of a weapon system based upon interchangeable parts. John Welch, owner of a shipping firm in Philadelphia, was one of these. He became the driving force behind the Philadelphia Exposition. He never had the responsibility for putting together a major exhibition, so he did not know that fairs took a great deal of time and even more money. John Welch did know what it took to ship a crate of produce from one city to another. He thought that exhibitions might have some of the same problems. John Welch knew also that shipping companies needed agents on the site to oversee the work. He selected a Cincinnati lawyer named Alfred T. Goshorn as Director General of the Centennial Exposition. There was an international exposition going on in Vienna in that spring of 1873, and John Welch knew that success lay in the shrewd assessment of the competition. He and Goshorn left for Vienna. There they found that profiteering, poor sanitation, and cholera were keeping people away by the tens of thousands. The Vienna exhibition was losing money faster than it could come in at the ticket booth. And in America, bad news. The Philadelphia banking house of J. Cook announced that it could not cover its obligations, and within hours, Wall Street was in a panic. The Great Depression of 1873 had begun. Less than a month later, Alfred Goshorn, touring the grounds at Fairmount Park, announced that the Philadelphia Centennial was ready to do business. He had a good team. Mrs. Elizabeth Gillespie, chairman of the Women's Centennial Executive Committee, who sold oyster suppers to half the country east of the Mississippi River and would keep the money rolling in. John Welch, the septuagenarian, who only grew younger and tougher as times got harder. William Stokely, the mayor of Philadelphia, who had his hand in some of the best pockets in town. H.J. Schwartzman, an architect from Bavaria, who designed the Centennial as one of his first big jobs in a new country. And Thomas Scott, president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, who ran people like he ran his locomotives. These people knew what they wanted. A fair unlike any that had been before. A place of pleasure, comfort, and convenience. A place for people to come and see under one roof all of the great works of mankind. It had to be an international fair, and it was going to open on time. The London Crystal Palace exhibition of 1851 had opened late, but that was excusable since it was the first of the great world expositions. The French opened their Paris International Exposition late in 1855, but then the French never did have a sense of time. To prove it, they opened another exposition late in 1867. Goshorn developed a long-range timetable which determined when things would be done. Over the next 3 years, many things would change and adjust these calculations, with one exception: the opening date, May 10th, 1876. That date never changed. Guidelines were developed for the exposition.
The Centennial visitor will have a clean bed and 2 substantial meals a day at reasonable prices.
Mayor Stokely canvassed Philadelphia to get 40,000 homeowners to agree. The city turned into a hotel overnight.
We want the people to be comfortable while they're being enlightened.
Somehow this was a lesson that fair builders had not learned before. Loftier goals always got in the way. 50 years earlier, going to the fair had been a manageable experience for most Americans. The scale was small, the theme was agriculture. Soon, however, these agricultural fairs came to resemble medieval bazaars, as examples of industry and invention were displayed alongside the products of the soil. So-called mechanics institutes in Philadelphia, Boston, and New York organized a number of exhibitions that emphasized man-made goods, setting the stage for America's first World's Fair, the New York Crystal Palace exhibition in 1853. By any standard, this exhibition was huge. But the Cincinnati Exposition of 1873 was even larger. American fairs, begun as a way to enlighten and entertain, had started to overwhelm. The Colossus on the Schuylkill River was an overwhelmer of the first magnitude. H.J. Schwartzman and Mrs. Gillespie created the Public Comfort Building, and it was a lot more than a place to rest. It was a palace of convenience, having resting rooms, reading and writing rooms, a post office, a telegraph office, a barber shop and shoe shine stand, places to retrieve lost children, language booths, and a seamstress to sew on lost buttons. But the one guideline that did the job was the last one.
We will offer free exhibition space to any and all. First come, first served.
Most fair planners sold exhibitors space. Goshorn had the notion that if exhibition space was free, there would be many people wanting to display their products. That being the case, there would be other people willing to pay good money to see them. This was New World boosterism, and the exhibitors responded. George Corliss among them. He had in mind a steam engine so large that it would drive 4 miles of shafting and 28 miles of belting. It would be the primary power source for Machinery Hall. Athlete of steel, William Dean Howells called it, without an ounce of superfluous metal on it. Corliss was the first of thousands. The initial response to exhibition space was so great that Schwartzman and his staff developed a plan on a grandiose scale. Art galleries with space for 8,000 people and an equal number of paintings. Machinery enclosures that spanned 20 acres. A botanical garden that would contain every known American plant. The Centennial Committee was numbed.
The cost of construction is, of course, more for the masonry.
$3, maybe $4 million ought to do the job. And John Welch began looking around. The original $25,000 he and Mayor Stokely had charmed out of the city of Philadelphia was long since spent. The venture into the sale of Centennial stock had been a financial disaster. His eye fell on the network of railroads using Philadelphia as a switching point. He had a talk with Scott of the Pennsylvania line, and suddenly a number of rail companies realized that a $500,000 contribution to the Centennial was in their best interest. Construction at Fairmount Park got underway. On April 12, 1874, Schwartzman designed his fairground headquarters. 42 days later, he and his staff moved in. This was a beginning. Word from the cost estimators. Main building, $2 million. Agricultural building, $1 million. Expenses of all kinds mounting up.
Governor to column spacing.
So, as I was
Oh, we've had to change the entire thing. Originally we had them,
Ladies, this is a drawing of the Women's Pavilion, one of the many fine buildings we hope to have for the Centennial.
Absolutely.
But in order to build these buildings, we must raise a lot of money.
Here's Pennsylvania.
Mrs. Gillespie and her zealous Women's Centennial Executive Committee went from town to town, picking up nickels and dimes. Mayor Bill Stokely's police force squeezed another $500,000 from the groaning citizens of Philadelphia. Scott jiggled his lobbyists in upstate Pennsylvania, and the state legislature voted $1 million toward the exposition. John Welch went for the big money in Washington City and came away with a congressional appropriation of $1.5 million for his efforts. Only later did the Supreme Court decide that Congress had acted in haste and that the money was really a loan. The nations of the world were coming, mostly out of curiosity, but also to learn. America was going to be on display under one roof, and what better way to improve business than to join in? The State Department was shocked and wrote to all of its embassies overseas advising them that they were not to extend invitations to foreign nations. They were too late. The foreigners were already setting up their exhibit stands. No head of state was more enthusiastic than the Emperor of Brazil, Dom Pedro. He was coming, and furthermore, he was bringing his empress. The Swedes shipped in a reluctant Prince Oscar with an exhibit on modern Swedish life. The French were coming. The Russians said they'd be there, as did the Italians and the British. China said yes, as did most countries that were countries, and some that were not. Buildings began to rise at Fairmount Park. Memorial Hall, a gift from the people of Pennsylvania. The main building, 1,880 feet long, 4 feet longer than the sum of the centennial year, and the largest building in the world. The Horticultural Building, designed by Schwartzman to hold every known American flower inside and 22,000 other plants outside. Fifteen foreign nations built their own pavilions. The Japanese constructing theirs in such an unusual manner that Director General Goshorn issued an order barring his men from wasting time watching them. Who ever heard of sawing a board while sitting down? 24 states entered the pavilion race, and Schwartzman and his staff were getting so speedy that they were designing some of them overnight. 56 private American firms thought their businesses important enough to warrant the expense of a building, and so they built them. Space within the main building was being snapped up at an accelerating pace. Space for inventions of all kinds. Space for communication. Space for the products of America. Colt's firearms. Tiffany silverware, Steinway pianos, Otis elevators, Butterick fashions, Hires root beer, Collins axes. Goshorn had 5,000 men working around the clock, and success was assured, if only there was enough time. For American exhibitors at their own centennial were far behind the exhibitors from other countries. The fairgrounds bustled with exotic peoples from all lands. Spanish soldiers painting cases, French engineers, Turkish carpenters in fez and bloomers. Goshorn and Welch created their own army, a brigade of broom wielders, fast-stepping legions of messenger boys, platoons of artists who painted rows of eagles and were glad to get to work, unpackers, registrars, stencilers, pay clerks, engineers, cooks, water boys. On April 1st, 1876, a chilling order circulated from Goshorn's office. No more uncut wood will be allowed on the fairgrounds. 40 days to opening. But still, the people came. Bartholdi arrived from Paris, but only the arm of the Statue of Liberty. But even so, it was a very big arm. Mrs. Maxwell of Colorado arrived to assemble her menagerie on the grounds of the Kansas and Colorado State Building. It astonished everyone that a lady of refinement and breeding could use a Winchester rifle with such authority. The Smithsonian Institution arrived with a wagon load of Indian material, but no Indians. They could not find many who spoke English and behaved circumspectly. Suddenly, it was May 9th, and under a wet spring sky, Welch and Goshorn, with His Majesty the Emperor Dom Pedro, made a last tour of the Centennial grounds. Dom Pedro wanted a preview of the fair. Alfred T. Goshorn wanted to make sure that the rubbish squad had picked up every last wood shaving. May 10th, 1876. Everyone was there. President and Mrs. Grant, of course, the Emperor of Brazil and his lovely Empress, the Chief Justice from the Supreme Court, The House and Senate, all the governors, admirals of the Navy, generals of the Army, the entire diplomatic corps, the officers of the Smithsonian Institution, the judges of the exhibition, the International Rifle Association, the Women's Centennial Executive Committee, and 200,000 other people.
Rather than defile their conscience or be untrue to their God.
Bishop Simpson prayed on and on, asking God's special blessing on these magnificent
For
works.
valuable discoveries and multiplied inventions, for labor-saving machinery relieving the toiling masses, for schools free as the morning light for millions of the
16 minutes later, the orchestra and choral assemblies presented a poem to the Centennial by John Greenleaf Whittier, set to music by John Payne of Massachusetts. John Welsh spoke eloquently and briefly as he gave the buildings to the Centennial Commission. And after a short speech by the President of the United States, the American flag unfurled over the main building. What was this Centennial Exposition? It was people, more than had gathered in any one place since the armies of the Potomac and Tennessee had marched together up Pennsylvania Avenue 11 years before. But this army had its women and children along, and these were a new kind of people, all pointed in different directions and thinking in different ways. Looking at their country and at each other for the first time, some of them liked what they saw. Others saw only what they liked. But no one who visited this fair was quite the same again. The thing was a dream and a nightmare. It could not be seen so much as it had to be experienced. It had the best and the worst. The newest and the oldest. The biggest and smallest. Of all the expositions before or after, it was unique. An introduction to a new America and a farewell to the old.
And the weight of that flywheel will enable you to make a complete batch so that as the making of the ice cream becomes harder.
It is the left canine here that grows out through the snout and produces this magnificent horn which popes and emperors in the Middle Ages used to...
There was a press that printed 1,000 newspapers in 1 hour. There was an engine that ran on oil instead of steam. A light that was made from electricity. A machine that could write letters. A device which mechanically calculated sums. There was George Washington's uniform displayed on a wire hanger. And a yellowed wax doll showing fashions from the court of Louis XV. Americans were proud of their centennial celebration in Philadelphia and thought that it spoke well of their progress over 100 years. They were right. This exhibition contained all that a nation could produce, stacked and arranged in endless rows that were calculated to impress and inspire all but the most hardened observer. Yet in some ways, the Philadelphia Centennial ignored the other America, that part which could not be tagged, shipped, labeled, and displayed. For there was no way to exhibit the fact that we had become, through a great civil war, one nation, or that we had become a people profoundly different from the rest of the world's people. The Great Exposition of 1876 could show the wonders of the present, but it could not anticipate the incredible future that was in store. For there were new Americans of Philadelphia who in the next century would challenge the frontiers of science and technology, of art and political thought. As there were old Americans attending this exhibition who had walked with the leaders of the Revolution. Celebrating their first 100 years, Americans at Philadelphia knew only that they had done the best that they could do. Indeed, they had.